Welcome everyone to the IISS Americas office, our outpost from London. It's good to see you all here today, and I'm excited to have our guest here to talk about, does conflict threaten Myanmar's political transition? We have three speakers with us today. Priscilla Clapp, who is a senior advisor at U.S. Institute for Peace and Asia Society, and a longtime member of IISS.
Yes.
And
the first female members.
Yeah. And we should have a special medal for that. And a retired minister-counsellor with the U.S. Foreign Service with the State Department. And during her 30-year career with the State Department, she served in Burma, South Africa, Moscow, Japan, on the policy planning staff, and with the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, among many other things, I'm sure. And Priscilla just returned from 3 weeks in Myanmar, so she is going to have a very fresh view on what's going on there to share with us. Welcome Max Hamilton, who is currently serving as a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for the 2017-18 year, where he's a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow. In his before and after, he is a career Foreign Service officer also at the State Department. Most recently served as Special Assistant to Tom Shannon, the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. Most relevant to our discussion today, he served as the Burma Unit Chief at State Department's Operations Center, and he has also done stints in Afghanistan, China, and Venezuela. All very easy locations, I'm sure. And so Max will address in his remarks today U.S. policy responses to the situation in Myanmar. And then we have Yun Sun, who is a senior associate on the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. And Yun has also spent some time as a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and spent time as a China analyst for the International Crisis Group based in Beijing, among other work. And she will focus on China's role in Rakhine State, which apparently is on the rise. So our event will last an hour. Our guest will provide some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion. We are recording this event. It'll be on the record, and will be available either video or just as audio on our website afterwards to share with others who are not able to be here to join us. And with that, I would like to start with Priscilla to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Leigh. Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. It's a great pleasure to be here today, particularly with my buddies, Max and Yun. As Leigh said, I have just come back from 3 weeks in Burma, and while I was there, I was able to meet with all of the top civilian leaders who are dealing with the Rakhine issue and other conflict issues. I did not meet with any of the top military leaders, although I had some discussions with military. So what I will be saying today does reflect their ideas and their remarks to me. And I include Aung San Suu Kyi in that. I had a nice, very good long meeting with her. I've known her for a long time, so it was nice to be able to spend some time, relaxing time with her. I'm going to address two issues today, briefly. The first one is the serious division that exists right now between the civilians and the military in the government, and particularly at upper levels. What happened in the Rakhine State was a case of the military taking things into their own hands and using their preferred method of dealing with insurgency, which is slash and burn. It's called the Four Cuts. This is a strategy that was devised by Ne Win for fighting the communist insurgency in the country, and it involves cutting all means of support for insurgent groups, starting with the village level, their families, their means of of survival. The military just goes through and destroys it all. They use that methodology in Rakhine State, although a lot of the damage that was ultimately done to the villages in Mongdo and Budidong was done by Rakhine youths, sort of hoodlums running through the villages, setting houses on fire and burning and looting. But with the security forces standing back and allowing it to happen, so they are complicit in that as well. The civilian part of the government had no control over this. I know that Aung San Suu Kyi tried to set some ground rules for the military engagement there, but I don't think they followed the ground rules. So the international reaction to this, and particularly blaming Aung San Suu Kyi initially, has sent a shockwave through the civilian population in the country. And they've come to they rallied to Aung San Suu Kyi's defense in this. There have been quite a few demonstrations in her favor. And that has, I think she went through a really dark period in September, but by October she had been buoyed in a way by the popular support she had, and decided that she was going to take things into her own hands. So she has put together a program for delivering humanitarian assistance, rebuilding the areas of Mongdo and Budidong that were destroyed, bringing the Rohingya refugees back. Well, it's not only Rohingya, there were Hindus and some others who went out with them. They're already coming back. Bringing the Rohingya back and engaging in some very serious long-term development of the Rakhine State to try and upgrade the economy there, because it is one of the poorest areas of the country. And many people believe that the poverty is a contributing factor to the communal tensions there. That may or may not be true. So she's calling this the Union Enterprise for Humanitarian Assistance, Resettlement, and Development, UEHRD. It is, at its heart, dedicated to implementing the recommendations of the Kofi Annan Commission. Those recommendations came out in August, just about the time of the ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army attack in Rakhine. When she first pledged to carry out those recommendations, she got a lot of pushback from the military and from the government party, USDP, which was in charge of the last government. So she knew she was facing a lot of trouble in trying to implement those recommendations. And I think that her decision to wrap it in a national program was designed to take away the implication that the foreign community was forcing this on the country. So she has put together a civilian-led effort to challenge military control of Rakhine and to move forward with a repatriation program. Whether it will work or not is still a big question, because she is facing enormous resistance on the ground. And the divisions between the military leadership and the civilian leadership are right now very intense. And this extends into the population in a way that it actually presents an existential threat to Aung San Suu Kyi herself. We have known for a while that there was some dark forces at work behind the scenes. One good example of that was the assassination of her lawyer, Kony, who happened to be a Muslim, early this year. And the person who masterminded that assassination got away. They got the other people who carried it out, but the mastermind got away, and he disappeared in Naypyidaw, the capital. So he is believed to be somewhere there under the protection of the military or the USDP. While I was there in October, 2 people were picked up at the Naypyidaw airport carrying lots of weapons. They were the sons of a former minister. One of these young men had run for office on under the USDP ticket. And as they started looking into these 2 guys, they found that they were part of a larger group that has uniforms, weapons, and they call themselves the Burma Ethnic Army. In other words, a Burma group. Burma is the majority ethnic group there, so they've got their own so-called army. It's a very ultra-nationalist group. Now, this also extends into the monkhood. There's a lot of division in the monkhood between the liberals and the ultra-nationalists. We, on the outside, hear the voices of the ultra-nationalists in the form of Werethu and his followers, but they're actually a minority, I think, within the monkhood. However, the strength of their voices is having an impact on the population, particularly older people, and sort of moving them towards the right now. And I think what Aung San Suu Kyi is trying to do is bring them back into what she considers to be, and what most of them consider to be, the true Buddhist precepts. And you see that in a lot of her recent speeches, reminding people that this is not consistent with Buddhist philosophy. So she's fighting a very difficult battle right now, and the conditions on the ground in Rakhine are not conducive to success with her program. I had a report just this morning from a friend of mine there who recently visited. She's been working in Rakhine for years with both the Rohingya and the Rakhine side of the communal divide. She is Burmese, and she said that there's just a lot of confusion and a lot of resistance within the Rakhine community, although the Rakhine community itself is split. So you see this split everywhere. You see it with the Rohingya, you see it with the Rakhine, between the militants and the more liberal side. And what they're trying to do is appeal to the more liberal side of the Rakhine, who actually feel that the Rohingya should be brought back, that they've been living there for a long time, that they should be brought back. Their conditions in the country should be normalized, and they should be allowed to move around. Moving around is one of the most important things that they would like to see, because they don't like to have them isolated in one little corner of the Rakhine state where they tend to grow into themselves. So that is, in short, what I found when I was there. There's a great deal of resentment right now against the international community because of the way they've reacted. And the UN in particular is being blamed for some of the problems in Rakhine. Not necessarily fairly, but the UN has been a little bit too outspoken and jumped the gun with facts and figures that turned out not to be correct in the past. And so they have kind of built a bad reputation for themselves on the ground. And right now they're trying very hard to, at least the government is determined to make this a national program and not lean on the international community. But I don't think they can really succeed without a great deal of international support. So with that, I will throw the floor over to my...
Great. So why don't we stay in the region and let Yun then talk about the Chinese response?
Sure. I'll briefly talk about China's policy and logic of China's policy and what's the impact of China's policy on the Rohingya issue over the broad transition in Myanmar. So China's policy towards the Rohingya issue has three features, basically like 3 points. The first one is China is supportive of the actions of the Myanmar government. China calls for international understanding of the effort that the Myanmar government has made to maintain the social responsibility. China has never uttered a word of condemnation towards the Myanmar government on the issue of Rohingya. Chinese ambassador to Myanmar defined the IISS attack as a terrorist attack, but that position was not shared by the Chinese foreign minister, who called the attack a violence, an act of violence. So I think there's a slight difference between what the ambassador said and what Beijing is saying, whether the attack by IISS should be defined as terrorism. As for specific support from China, I see two kinds of support. The first one is the diplomatic support for Myanmar government and UN. In this past May, China blocked a statement by the Security Council about the Rohingya issue. And then in September, China again defended Myanmar's position at the UN Security Council. As for material assistance, in September, China provided, I believe, a total of $3 million in terms of donation. So $2 million was for the Yangon Red Cross and $1 million was for the Myanmar civilian government. That's the monetary donation. And there are also some interesting security material donation that China made towards the government. And specifically, China donated bulletproof helmets and law enforcement recorders to the police force of Myanmar. So I think the donation was arranged through the civilian government, but not through Tatmadaw. And the Chinese made a point that, well, it seems that there have been a lot of controversies about how the military and the police has enforced law in their region. Therefore, we believe the law enforcement recorders will be highly helpful in this regard. So that's the Chinese support, diplomatic and material. The second characteristic of China's position is China does not have a position on the Rohingya issue per se. And the Chinese statement is that this issue has a long history and has complicated and sensitive origin. The government statement is very nuanced and very subtle. The Chinese government almost made no reference to the ethnicity issue or the religious aspect of this conflict. Instead, you don't see Chinese government, either the embassy or the foreign ministry or any government agency involved, call the Rohingya refugees. This term does not appear in the Chinese government statements. Instead, the Chinese term is that the affected people in the Rakhine state or displaced people from Rakhine due to the violent actions violent activities in the Rakhine state. But that's the second feature. The third feature of China's policy is the balancing diplomacy China plays between Myanmar and Bangladesh. So China, in a quite rare maneuver, offered to mediate between Bangladesh and Myanmar. And this happened when the Chinese Special Envoy for Asian Affairs flew to Bangladesh in late April to provide that mediation. So on one hand, China provided assistance to Myanmar, but on the other hand, China also provided 150 tons of material donation to the Bangladesh government. So I think the Chinese are quite interested in playing a role. So China's expressed, well, the Chinese special envoy was hospitalized later in summer, and I suspect that is the reason that he has not been particularly articulate during the most recent crisis. But the Chinese foreign ministers do express a willingness to support negotiation and dialogue between Myanmar and Bangladesh on the issue of refugee. So why does China have this policy? There are three reasons China has this policy. The first logic in the near term is that China has been struggling with the issue as for how to regain its influence in Myanmar after the after the democratic transition in the country, how to restore China's influence in the country. And currently, when Myanmar is under the international isolation, And faced with a lot of international hostility, the Chinese definitely see this as a good opportunity to repair the ties with Myanmar and to demonstrate that China is a friendly and loyal supporter of Burma. So for China, the Rohingya crisis is more perceived as an opportunity in the near term to restore their influence. The second logic of China's policy is that China has had counterterrorism cooperation with the Myanmar military for a couple of years. And this was motivated by China's own Muslim problem. And Yunnan province, although it's pretty far away from the Xinjiang autonomous region, Yunnan actually has a very large Muslim population. And the Chinese Muslim, the Uyghur refugees, they use Yunnan and the porous border as one primary channel to flee China, which is why you see a lot of Uyghur refugees in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, in Thailand, and in Malaysia. So China has pursued this counterterrorism cooperation with Taliban, and that has at least 4 or 5 years of history on the issue of Rohingya. And looking in the long term, and perhaps in the long term, the most important logic of China's policy is that China has significant investment in Rakhine State. Although not in the northern Rakhine State where the Rohingya population is more prevalent and more on the south side of Rakhine, but the total amount of this, for example, the pipeline is 2.5 billion US dollars, and the Chopio Special Economic Zone is estimated to be at 10 billion US dollars. So put this all together, when China think about the long-term effect of the instability and of the international isolation in Rakhine State, it's going to have a major impact over the Chinese investment. To say the least, if China is going to build the Chopio Special Economic Zone and try to attract international investors to invest in the Chopio Special Economic Zone, an unstable Rakhine State is not going to be conducive to that campaign. But from the Chinese perspective, either condemnation of the Burmese government or assistance to the Burmese government will not be helpful for the Chinese investment, apparently. So for the Chinese to maintain almost an indifferent and neutral position on the issue of Rohingya, providing assistance to a humanitarian crisis in Rakhine State is regarded as the most logical and optimum policy. So what impact does China's policy have over the transition of Myanmar? First of all, the most important impact we can see is the regaining of influence by China in Myanmar. China's support of the NLD government at UN in 2017 vividly reminds people of China's blocking of the sanction resolution at the UN Security Council 10 years ago, and that was a military government. And back 10 years ago, the Burmese government and Burmese people and society were hugely appreciative of what China did for Myanmar at UN. And ironically, 10 years later, we have a democratic government in Myanmar, and we see history repeating itself. But as for whether China's regained influence or the enhancement of China's influence in Myanmar is a good thing or a bad thing for Myanmar's transition, I think that remains to be seen. On one hand, we know that China doesn't have the best record in terms of investment or their behavior in Myanmar. But on the other hand, I would say that after the 5 years of turbulent relations under President Dan Sen, China has been contemplating how to make their policy towards Myanmar, both economic and political policies, more mature. And I think China has adjusted its behavior and its policy towards Myanmar. And on the other hand, Myanmar, after all, even with its international isolation, Myanmar has diversified its international relations and will not have the same asymmetrical dependence on China like it did 10 years ago. But the second impact is more direct, I would say, that with all this international attention and also domestic attention placed on the Rakhine issue, the issue of peace process and the issue of the northern Myanmar's ethnic rebels has become a secondary consideration, and I don't think that is good news for the transition of the Myanmar government. And since the beginning of this year, it is visible that the input and contribution and the resources that our side has placed on the peace process has been mitigated from China, from the civilian government, and even from the ethnic rebels in northern Myanmar. So if we believe that peace, democracy, and prosperity are the eventual goals of this transition, then the Rohingya issue inevitably and undoubtedly has diverted the resources and the efforts that all the parties involved could have placed on more important issues. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Max, if you can give us some insight into U.S. government responses and thoughts.
Thanks, Leigh, and thanks, Priscilla and you, and I'm grateful to be here today with all of you. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the policy logic behind U.S. policy, and then the U.S. response to the current crisis, and then offer some thoughts on the way ahead. So under the previous administration, a number of diplomatic initiatives were begun to open relations with adversarial regimes, and Burma was one of these. And U.S. engagement with Burma was premised on the idea that engagement rather than isolation would be the best way of promoting democracy and human rights in the country. And significantly, with respect to Burma, this was a policy that enjoyed broad bipartisan support. At the same time, I think there was a recognition that the most essential actor in this process was going to be the people of Burma, but the United States, through a combination of pressure and support, could play an important role in facilitating this transition and moving these policies forward. A good example is the November 2015 elections, where the United States worked with the international community and local partners to build the capacity of the Burmese government to conduct credible, inclusive, and transparent elections. This included assistance to train over 7,300 political party members and over 300 civil society organizations to participate in the election and the reform process. And I think the elections themselves were a success. You know, millions of people, some voting for the first time, helped produce the first democratically elected civilian-led government in Burma in over half a century. At the same time, I think, though, that those of us who followed Burma closely, whether within the U.S. government or outside the U.S. government, recognized that this transition was fragile and incomplete, and that the elections, while they were a necessary step, were not sufficient to kind of complete the transition. And as Priscilla and Yoon have mentioned, the civilian-led government inherited massive problems. So at a structural level, the Burmese military still controlled the three kind of key security ministries. They had a reservation for 25% of the seats in parliament for the military, and enormous economic control over state-owned economic enterprises. And then Burma had the longest-running civil war in the world, and the relationship between the ethnic minorities and the government was complex. Of course, you know, the Rohingya, they have been oppressed for decades. They were viewed as a threat, and there was a deep antagonism in Burmese society against them. I recall going to Rakhine in 2014 to the northern part of the state on the border with Bangladesh, and it was obvious, you know, the level of kind of isolation and discrimination that existed against this group. So I think for folks working in the U.S. government, there was a clear recognition that a crisis in Rakhine could present a threat to the transition and the ability of the United States to support it. In fact, the day after the election, the U.S. Embassy in Yangon immediately shifted its priorities from the election to how do we help this new civilian government address the situation in Rakhine. So the attacks on August 25th by these militants against Burmese security forces did not come as a complete surprise, and we had always been concerned, and some Rohingya that you would talk to were also concerned about the military's potential for overreaction to some kind of terrorist threat. So moving to kind of the U.S. response post-August 25th, I think there have been a combination of diplomatic assistance and accountability measures. On the diplomatic front, U.S. officials have been very active in the region. Undersecretary Shannon, who's the number 3 official in the State Department, was in Bangladesh over the weekend. Secretary Tillerson has called Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing, the commander-in-chief of the Burmese military, and he plans to visit Burma later this month. The head of the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration led a delegation to Burma recently. They went to Rakhine. They also went to Bangladesh to talk about how we can improve humanitarian access in Rakhine State. And the message has basically been, to end the violence, to take care of displaced populations, expand humanitarian and media access, and hold those guilty of committing crimes accountable. And as Priscilla mentioned, there's been some progress. Aung San Suu Kyi kind of laid out goals for repatriation and humanitarian assistance earlier in October. Burma has indicated more of a willingness to talk to Bangladesh about repatriation. They sent a senior official to Bangladesh for these discussions. But if history is any guide, and this is not the first time we've had this huge wave of people fleeing Rakhine, this is going to be a long process, and it's going to take a long time to resolve. On the assistance front, the United States has given over $104 million in FY17 to displaced populations on both sides of the border, and this is life-saving support, food, water, sanitation, and health. And then in terms of accountability, there's a number of options available for the United States, both unilaterally and multilaterally. Even after the transition, the United States has maintained significant restrictions on the Burmese military, so there's still an embargo on military sales to Burma. Senior Burmese military officials who want to travel to the United States need to get a waiver under the JADE Act. Those waivers have all been suspended. There's also potential for economic actions against individuals who have committed atrocities under the JADE Act. Under the Leahy law, any support for units operating in northern Rakhine or their officers has been suspended. And then there are potentially other measures that the administration could take under the Magnitsky Act, as well as pursuing accountability through the UN and the Human Rights Council, and pressing for access for fact-finding missions into Rakhine, which the United States has co-sponsored. So just to conclude, I think over the long term, it's going to be essential to address kind of the underlying factors that have caused this crisis in Rakhine. I think the Rakhine Advisory Commission and the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission, as Priscilla mentioned, would be a good start. This includes some kind of credible pathway to citizenship for populations in Rakhine and development. I would argue that the civilian government, as imperfect as it is, still represents the best chance for democracy and human rights in Burma in decades. And a Burma under military rule would not be in the best interests of the Burmese people. It wouldn't be in the best interests of the ethnic minorities, including the Rohingya, and it wouldn't be in U.S. interests. So it's going to take a long time to address the mindsets and attitudes that contribute to fear, racism, and intolerance in Rakhine. But I would argue that a return to isolationism would make this process harder, not easier.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you.
Well, the three of you have given us a lot of food for thought, so I'd like to open up to everyone here for questions. And we're going to pass around the microphone mainly so that the recording gets everybody, if you don't mind waiting. But we'll start.
Thank you, and thank you to all three panelists for those very interesting presentations. There's one subject that you didn't raise that's of great interest to me, and that is the state of the ARSA insurgency. Since the initial ICG report in whatever month it was in, summer, there has been a dearth of good analytical material.
One was in November last year.
Sorry. Whenever, time flies, Priscilla, especially at certain ages. All right, whenever it was, there has been a dearth of really good analysis of the insurgency since then. And I wondered if, particularly Priscilla, if you picked up anything on your trip that would illuminate the status of the insurgency and the insurgent leadership themselves, their plans, and perhaps their relationship with outside sources of support.
I can tell you what I know, but it's not necessarily authoritative. I spent some time with the person who writes the ICG reports, and he is a person who's been in touch with the leader directly. That is by way of confirmation that there is such an organization, that the leader comes out of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, speaks Arabic and Urdu, and maybe a little bit of Bengali. So it's my impression now, and particularly from what I learned when I was there, that ARSA as it exists today is in Bangladesh and not really in Burma. If there are any remnants of it in Burma, they're way up in the hills in the far northern part of Rakhine, which is sort of inaccessible, and I don't think the security forces are even present there. But they were largely displaced by the military actions in Mongda and Butidong, and they are now what's left of them in Bangladesh. And I think they are active in the refugee camps. I've heard some reports of them going after Hindus and sort of strong-arming the Rohingya. But I don't think that they're very strong right now. They are making threats. They've threatened attacks in other parts of Myanmar, in cities. I don't know whether this will materialize. I think the main danger of ARSA is the platform it provides, or the magnet it provides for other groups, ISIS-related, Al-Qaeda-related, or, what's that, the Pakistani group related, to come in, to find their way in and carry out some nasty attacks. I think that's the main danger, but I think ARSA itself is poorly equipped and really just exists within the Rohingya community.
Any sense that the military or civilian government has a depth of knowledge about ARSA or its leaders or even its followers?
I think they rely on the ICG reports.
That's certainly by the summer that was the case. They literally called them, but
They've received some information from Indian intelligence, and Indian intelligence is probably better than most as far as they're concerned, because they pick up the communications coming from between them and Pakistan and people back in other parts. There are a lot of Rohingya in India, in Pakistan, and throughout the area, and I think there's a very active means of communication among the diaspora.
Is there any cooperation that you sense between Bangladeshi intelligence people, who are also quite good in some respects, and
I don't know. I do know that relations between Bangladesh and Burma have never been very good. I don't think that they've suddenly, morphed into friendly relations overnight. I don't know, but I don't think that the security forces have good connections in Bangladesh, but there may be some. The border affairs people may have some connections in Bangladesh, but the others I don't think do. More with India.
anybody else have other insights?
By the way, there is a Rohingya community in Kunming as well.
Where?
Kunming.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
That's not
Max?
helpful for the Chinese.
Yeah, Max, did you have anything to add to that, or are we ready for the next question?
I would just say that the impression that I get from talking to folks at our embassy is similar to what Priscilla said, that it's hard to gauge the depth of support for ARSA. There is some evidence that ARSA has engaged in tactics of intimidation, but and it seems like they get outside funding, but hard to know exactly how widespread support for them is.
I can tell you that they were actually bumping off Rohingya leaders that they saw as cooperating with the government. Between the October attack last year and the August attack this year, they had killed off somewhere between 70 and 100 of the Rohingya, and viciously by slitting throats and severing heads and that kind of thing. And they would post a notice. They would actually identify people that were in their sights, and within a couple of days they'd be dead. So they were actively discouraging any cooperation with the government in moving forward with the citizenship process and other measures, humanitarian assistance, so forth.
Actually, when you ask a question, if you could state your name and where you're from.
Okay, I'm Steve Hirsch. I'm a freelance journalist. Priscilla, I think you danced around, but you didn't quite get to one question that I have, which is whether you think this conflict actually threatens the political transition.
I do. I danced around it, yes. I hesitate to make definitive statements about that, but I think there's a real threat to Aung San Suu Kyi herself. That's what I was implying. And it's coming from these sort of dark forces. I think the military planned this transition very carefully from the lead up to the Constitution itself, the elections, the Thein Sein government. They didn't expect the NLD to take over the government in the second 5 years of the transition. They wanted a much slower movement forward, and one that would allow them to take care of these internal problems. And they did not anticipate some of the impact that the reforms would have on the population itself and the way that things would go. And I think that they would be more comfortable returning to a military-led form of civilian elected government, authoritarian elected government, like they had originally planned with the USDP on top. But the USDP is very unpopular, so it just doesn't look like it's going to happen. I don't know. It's a dilemma. It looked to me like Min Aung Hlaing had political ambitions himself, but I think those have been pretty much dashed because he has not. He's made some big mistakes in the Rakhine situation, and he's now persona non grata with the international community, which wouldn't be good for a presidential candidate. So I think that it is a real threat to the transition. It could set it back. The peace process is languishing right now. I don't see the chances of that moving forward much. The military is the big problem there. The military is just obstructing a lot of movement in the country.
Do you think, and I think you just almost addressed this, do you think that the international obsession with the situation in Rakhine State is drawing needed attention away from other continuing, there continue to be other conflicts within the country. There continues to be other issues which were why there was such a pressure for change.
Yes, it does that, but it always has. And, a lot of the attention to Rakhine is driven by forces outside of the country that, just can't be controlled. There's been a lot of attention to it ever since 2012, to the detriment of other parts of the country. But even attention, I think, to other parts of the country isn't going to solve the problem right now. They have to solve it themselves. And the problem is that the divisions have just become so deep right now, and they're being exacerbated by the international reaction to this, the blame game. Because it's making people hunker down and say, well, we don't need the Western world. It's not coming from the Asian neighbors. The Asian neighbors have been much more supportive and willing to help with it. And the most favored outside donor right now in the country is Turkey, because Turkey has come in with no strings attached and really given a lot of assistance in the Rakhine State on both sides. So even the Rakhine like Turkey. It's interesting, but they're very anti-UN and very anti-Western donors right now. So I think that I don't know, we're kind of in a bind in how effective our communications can be right now with them, including the civilian government. But I do think it's a defining moment right now. But I think that Aung San Suu Kyi is purposely pitting herself in a way against the military. Now, it's kind of ironic that the international community doesn't see that this program she's put together is a direct challenge to the military. She has asked them to come in and help, and Min Aung Hlaing has said that he would help, but I don't know that he will. And they hold so many of the cards on the ground that it's going to be very difficult to make this program work without some accommodation by the military.
Other question?
Richard Cook, Mitsubishi. You mentioned this ongoing tension between civilian and military. I guess this question is about sanctions, and to the extent that international community is responding with sanctions, it's very narrow, targeted at actual perpetrators and the leadership, the military leadership, and it seems like the U.S. is heading in that direction as well. What's your sense of how supportive Aung San Suu Kyi is of that effort?
Well, she's come out against it. She said that any sanctions like that are not going to be helpful, particularly singling out one group over another. Furthermore, the military is blaming her for this. They're suggesting that she has orchestrated these sanctions on the part of the Western governments. So it's not a win for her in her relations with the military. And the business community, regardless of how they feel about the military, which is not very warm and fuzzy right now, don't want to see any kind of sanctions that are economically or individually targeted, because they're afraid that it's going to just keep moving forward. And they are very concerned about the economic impact of this. It's already having an economic impact. Tourism is down 25%. That is cancellations. And they're worried that investment is going to have a big impact on investment, particularly Western investment. I don't think they're worried about Asian investment, because that's continuing, but it's Western investment. And they've been working, I talked to quite a few of the businessmen there, and they've been working very hard to sort of bring themselves up to our standards as a result of the previous sanctions on cronies, and they don't want to see themselves back in that situation again. So many of them are being very careful not to get pulled back into support for the military like they had to before. And they're rallying to, it's interesting. Aung San Suu Kyi has pulled a lot of the private community into her program. Businessmen are financing it right now. And she's put together groups of young people. They've recruited young people. They're training them in Yangon, sending them down to Rakhine State, Sidhway, Mongdo, Budidong, to start helping with the rebuilding program. It could be a disaster, but what she's trying to do is get popular support behind this. But no, sanctions are not something that they welcome at this point.
Max, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think Priscilla is right. I guess with regard to sanctions, there are kind of two questions I think we need to ask. One question is, and I mentioned before, kind of the targeted measures that you raised. But in terms of broader sanctions, one question is, are broader sanctions really the best tool to address the hatred and intolerance and fear that exist in Burma? And then secondly, this question about the contagion effect that Priscilla mentioned. To what extent would broader sanctions undermine the ability of Burma's democracy to deliver? So I think those are kind of two questions that need to be considered in that when you raise the idea of broader sanctions.
But if things go backward, I think there'll be a lot of finger pointing at the Western world and the UN.
By both sides of the Burma?
Well, and by Asians. I mean, not just from Burma, but other places too. See, she's shaking her head. China.
I'm not China, but I think that will be the Chinese perspective.
No, I know. I didn't mean to suggest you were China, but you're shaking your head implies to me that you're saying that China would certainly, yeah.
And the Chinese are very happy to step into whatever vacuum this would create and see that as an opportunity and expand their influence and also repair their ties with the Burmese people. It's a perfect opportunity to show that while you love the Americans and see what happens. And essentially, by the end of the day, you still have to come back to China for the support that you need. And I think that has been very effective.
We have time for one more question before we wrap up. If anyone-
SIP. I wanted to ask Yoon actually about given that the UEHRD is very focused on economic development as the way forward for Rakhine, what's China's role in providing that economic development or assistance?
Development and assistance. So Chinese current focus is still first of all on the infrastructure development in the Rakhine State, and Rakhine State is a key location because it's right on the Bay of Andaman Sea, and the infrastructure that the Chinese originally wanted to build had 5 components. So it had a oil pipeline, a gas pipeline, a high-speed railway, a highway, and a telecommunication cable that goes from Rakhine State up to China. So we know that the railway project had been aborted so far, but I don't think the Chinese has given up hope. So I would say that on the one hand, if we look at what China's priority now is, first of all, infrastructure broadly, but more specifically on the Chopio Special Economic Zone, that the Chinese argument has been that once we get the economic zone, special economic zone going, you will see more foreign investment, which will stimulate job creation, which will also bring on vocational training in the Rakhine State that will have the long-term stabilization impact in the conflict affected areas. But then just published a piece this morning with Nikkei Asia Review about the controversy associated with Chopio Special Economic Zone. That the Burmese question is, well, since this is China's strategic interest, why should we be paying so much for a project that our aspiration is relatively moderate, but China's aspiration is much more enormous compared to the Burmese aspiration. So, and also related to the deep sea port, the Burmese Navy and the Army actually has a concern about the dual use potential for the deep sea port. So that is to say, I think the development of the Chopio Special Economic Zone will be slow, and it would not be as smooth as the Chinese originally expected. And since that project is not seeing the projects that the Chinese want to see, I think the Chinese input on other aspects of economic development in the Rakhine State, one will be coordinated with the NLD government's request to China. What they want, they will have to make the ask to Beijing. And secondly, it will have to be tied with how about Chopio Special Economic Zone, that our star project in the region. We don't see much discussion about the Misong Dam, the suspended Misong Dam project. The Chinese used to hold that as a precondition for further discussion about economic investment into the country. I think that issue has now been more or less shelved, but the progress of the Chopio Special Economic Zone will be the key determinant here, I would say.
Let me just add, if I may, to what Yoon said. There's a lot of pressure on the NLD government right now to go forward with the Chopio port and special economic zone from the Chinese. And I wouldn't be surprised if it does eventually, if they don't eventually cave somehow. They've managed to increase their ownership of it from 15 to 30%, but they still don't have the money to buy that ownership, so they would probably have to borrow it from China. It's going to put them in enormous debt, and I don't know whether there'll be a political or even a military backlash to that, because as Yoon said, the military is very concerned about real Chinese intentions with that water port that doesn't need to be that deep for shipping. And it's also probably the most expensive port project China has undertaken outside of China. So the question is why? Why is it so expensive? Is this designed purposely to burden Burma with all of this debt and make them beholden to China over the long run? The other thing is that if and when it does go forward, there's going to be real pressure on Burma for the railroad and the highway, because without those, it's going to be very hard for the special economic zone and even the port to be profitable, because they would have to be able to connect directly with Yunnan by surface in order to be facilitating Chinese trade through that port. It can't exist on Burmese trade alone. It has to be Chinese. So, there's a whole string of things that could happen. The other thing is that part of this UEHRD plan is 2 more special economic zones in Rakhine, one on the border in the Mongdal-Budidong area to facilitate kind of economic trade and connections with Bangladesh, and one probably somewhere around Sidway.
If I can just add to that, sorry, just reminds me of the comments. So I was in Burma in January, in April, in June, in August, then in September, along the border.
She lives there.
Yeah, I spent about half my time there. So with the railway, I think the Burmese army, one of their concerns is that if China is going to turn the Chopio deep sea port into a dual-use port, and then they have the railway, then that will give the Chinese military the convenient access for both the PRA army to transport their soldiers, their troops through the railway. And then the Navy connection is right there. But I think there's a level of paranoia there, but it's also true. But whether I don't think the Chinese are deliberately setting a death trap for Burma in this case, in terms of the size of the Chukwu Special Economic Zone. When I was in China discussing with the Chinese officials and the Chinese companies, their most natural reaction is, isn't bigger the better? Isn't building them the perfect project that has everything attached to it, and it's like a one stop that you are getting this special economic zone with everything attached and everything equipped, and they thought that's a good thing for Burma. But on the other hand, I think from the Chinese local government and the company's perspective, they are not going to spend the money. The money is going to come out of the Chinese central government policy banks. So for them, this is a capital feast that they would not waste the opportunity. So for them to augment the size, to increase the scale of the project makes perfect sense for the actors on the ground. But I don't think the intention, well, there is actually a strategic calculation in Beijing that let's make sure that the Burma will be so in debt to us that they would never be able to do anything against our will. And last but not least, although the Burmese negotiated to increase their ownership from 15% to 30% of the deep sea port, their offer is that we still want to contribute only 15% of the money. And the Chinese find that very perplexing. So you're doubling your ownership, but you still want to contribute the original share of 15%
They're
of the
offering the
funding.
land.
The land is being translated into the ownership, but anyway, so I think that is interesting.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately, but thank you very much for joining us here today at the IISS America's office. Thank you, Priscilla, Yun, and Max, for your great insights.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And please join me in thanking our speakers.